Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and it's a great pleasure to be speaking for the National Secular Society. Strangely enough, I have quite happy memories of this somewhat Pyongyang-esque building, because the last time I was here was about 10 years ago for a conversation on philo-Semitism between Christopher Hitchens and Martin Amis. A wonderful event, I'm sure you could probably see online somewhere. The evening went slightly downhill, but the fact that I remember we tried to find somewhere in the Russell Square area afterwards to have dinner and could find nowhere except for one establishment, I remember, which promised that they could give us food but not drink, which was exactly the opposite of what we wanted. It's a great pleasure to be speaking for the National Secular Society, and also, I might say, to see some great heroes of exactly the discussion we're having today in this room. It's a particular pleasure to see Peter Tatchell and Richard Dawkins, who have... I know I can speak for everybody in this room, not just the admiration of everyone here, but so many people around the world, apart from anything else, on having been willing and able to talk about precisely the difficult issues which we're talking about here today. It's also always, as ever, a great pleasure to be with Rahil Raza and Maajid Nawaz, who I can never hear enough of, and I'm sure it's the same for you. They are real points of light these days, both of them. And the work they do is a rare bit of illumination, I think, in difficult times. I'm going to limit my remarks, I think, to have as much time as possible for Q&A, discussion, argument, whatever you like. And we'll just make a few comments further to those that have already been made, all of which I very much agree with. The first is just to observe that, I mean, we are stumbling through this period in this country, and I would argue in the West in general, but particularly in Europe. We're stumbling through this period, and nobody anticipated it, nobody expected it to come. I'm in the middle of a book at the moment, and it's just extraordinary. You read any of the thinkers, politicians in particular, in recent decades across Europe, and just nobody predicted the kind of conversations we are having today. In 1989, until Valentine's Day that year, nobody had heard of a fatwa. Until 2015 in January, very few people in Europe understood the details of Islamic blasphemy law until 2005 in Denmark and so on. And we're sort of trying to struggle through this and find a way, and it's very messy. And it's going to be very messy for a long time to come. And I think it would be very unwise to predict how it's going to go. But I wanted to make a few comments about trends, as it were. It's been exceptionally unhelpful, but utterly understandable that politicians throughout the West have responded to the upsurge in Islamist violence and intimidation by saying that their behavior has nothing to do with Islam. It's absolutely understandable. We know what they're trying to say. They're trying to say that the terrorists and the extremists speak for a minority, and what's more, you mustn't blame all Muslims, you mustn't take this out on your Muslim neighbor, and so on. It's a very laudable and understandable political stance, as it were, to take. But the difficulty is, of course, that we all know that it's also wrong, and a mistake to say for other reasons. For years, we've had this. David Cameron, when he was Prime Minister, slowly sort of evolved his rhetoric on this. But my favorite ever, I think, was US President Barack Obama when he said after one of the, there was a set of, obviously everyone remembers ISIS beheadings in Syria, and after every one, David Cameron or Obama, whoever it was, whose citizen had just been beheaded, would come out on the steps and say this had nothing to do with Islam. And then I think the last of the US hostages who was beheaded, Barack Obama said at one point, it not only had nothing to do with Islam, it had less to do with Islam than any other religion. Which is kind of, if a guy cuts someone's head off while shouting Allah is greatest, I don't think the Buddhists should bear anything for that. But everybody is at that. And there's another strange movement you can see during the same period, which is the thing of absolutely everybody becoming an expert on Islam and absolutely everybody becoming an expert on the Quran and Hadith. And you hear this all the time now. Only 3 years ago at the Conservative Party conference, the then Home Secretary, now Prime Minister Theresa May, in her conference speech starts quoting her favourite bits of the Quran. I mean, it was weird. I mean, it was like, George Bush did that famously after 2001. He went to the local Islamic center in Washington and said, as the Quran says, although I find it better in this translation, as if he'd spent the previous evening, you know, sort of, yeah, I prefer, doesn't quite get the Demotic Arabic, but it'll do. And you know, and Theresa May does it, everybody does it. Again, I mean, we sort of know why, but it might just be unhelpful. It's certainly unhelpful when our new Prime Minister commissions an inquiry into the practice of Sharia law in the UK and appoints the inquiry. And who does she put on the inquiry but some imams? What do you think their conclusions are going to be about Sharia law in the UK, roughly speaking? Starting from a point of deep criticism, or... Now, you see, these are very, very deep waters, and I don't envy the politicians on it. It's very easy to mock them, but it's obviously not going to be easy. I warn, and have done for a long time, though, about some of the euphemism which is been going on, because I think that no good can come from it, and I'll explain why. During the period that politicians have all tried to keep up this facade that the Islamic blasphemy police have nothing to do with Islam, the jihadists have nothing to do with Islam, Islam has nothing to do with Islam. During the same period, the publics of the West have come to totally different conclusions. And let me give you just 3 polls from 3 countries from 3 years ago. So these are polls carried out in Europe in 2013, okay, before Charlie Hebdo, before last November in Paris, before the Brussels attacks, and before the Cologne attacks in New Year, and so on. So in 2013, 7% of the German public said that they associated Islam with openness, tolerance, or respect for human rights. 7% of the Germans said that. Turn it the other way around. In France, in 2013, 67% of the French public said that they thought that Islam itself, the religion, not Islamism, Islam, is incompatible with the French state. 67%. The same poll showed that 73% of the French public viewed Islam very negatively. It's the same story across every European country. In the Netherlands, the same year, 68% of the Dutch people said that they thought there was, quote, enough Islam in Holland. Now, I would submit that, and there are polls from the last few years, but I would submit to you that in the last 3 years, those concerns haven't gone down. That it's not the case that more French people in 2016 have favorable views towards the religion of Islam than they did in 2013. And so we see this huge gulf emerging, and I think it is a very troubling gulf. And it is a gulf between publics who, as it were, to use a slightly gross left-right analogy, but to use it for a second, publics who are going very, very clearly to the right on these issues because of the facts that are happening in front of them, and politicians simultaneously stampeding to the left. And that opens, I put it no stronger than this, an extremely troubling possibility in our time. It's my belief, by the way, that the problems for Islam are not insuperable, not insolvable, partly because of what both Majid and Raheel have said earlier, but that they are exceptionally difficult, and that they may well be even harder than Christianity's troubles in recent centuries. One example I would give you, but I think it's a sort of useful place to start, is that if you do go through the Christian scriptures, there is a verse in the Gospel of Matthew that is usually wheeled out But apart from that, most people would find it hard to disagree with very much said by Jesus. And when somebody says to him, how many times should I forgive my brother? He, says 7 times, no, 70 times 7. In other words, forgive endlessly. A pretty good message, whatever your views on the rest of what his followers did. But I would just put it like this. I mean, would the history of Christianity, bloody as it undoubtedly has been and still is, would it have been less bloody or more bloody if even on one occasion the founder of Christianity had, when asked what to do with your brother when he offends you, said, chop off his head? I think it would have been a lot worse, and this is a simplification of one of the problems that all Muslim reformers have. And as I say, it's not unsolvable, it's not insuperable, but it is very considerable, and it's a big mistake to pretend otherwise. Finally, I would just make these observations. In the UK, to go back to that issue of, as it were, what mainstream public opinion is, I would submit that underneath a lot of this is another concern, and it's a concern that Rahil's excellent film and remarks in particular touched upon. A deep concern that people have, and I would give you one example to focus on. The Trojan Horse affair in Birmingham 2 summers ago that revealed terrible things being taught in British schools, not in Islamic seminaries, not in madrasas, but in what were meant to be secular state-run schools that had been taken over by these extreme ideologues. That story was concerning enough, but I think I'm not the only person in Britain who also noticed with great concern the fact that those revelations were objected to, pushed back against, called lies by absolutely every organized Muslim group in this country that I can think of other than the Quilliam Foundation. Everybody else tried to cover it over. Everybody else tried to say it was lies. Everybody else tried to say, well, it's all Michael Gove making it up, or so on and so forth. And this is a very, very troubling thing. Because I would trust that you, anybody else, if we discovered that a school that in any way was associated with us was teaching hatred in assemblies and chants and songs against minorities in the morning, that we wouldn't just say, thank goodness you've caught this, but would feel a deep sense of shame that this was happening in our name. And I think that a great many people are very worried when they see these organizations that, as I say, endlessly present themselves as representing a community, pushing back against every single thing like that that comes out. It's an understandable instinct not to want, as it were, your community's dirty laundry to be aired in public. We've seen it with the Catholic Church, we've seen it with all sorts of institutions. But this is one that really is going to be a problem in the years ahead. That, as I say, in wrapping up these remarks, and as I say, leaving as much time as possible for questions and discussion, this is why secularism matters so much now. I hope I'm not insulting you if I say that were it not for the subject of this panel, it would be my view that the National Secular Society would be a sort of, pleasant, meeting place of people with similar thoughts whose raison d'etre had passed, arguably. And I would submit that because of this issue, you and your association are on the very front line of the most important discussion of our time. I'm extremely proud that you are there. I'm very proud to be here, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.